Darwin gives us this hypothetical story that during a very early period of human history, human beings lived in small groups, and the senior male human dominated all the females sexually, the mother and the daughters and so on. And then the sons, out of frustration, killed the father. Killed the father in order to have access to the females. You know, by the way, this actually is a common phenomenon in the animal world. I remember reading once when I was in Costa Rica. I remember learning about, there's a type of bird in Costa Rica where two male birds are a team. There's an older male bird and a younger male bird, and they sing a duet together to attract female birds. And depending on the beauty of the song, the female will be attracted. And they sing in a harmony. The older male teaches the younger male how to harmonize with his song so as to attract female birds. But what's very interesting is that only the older male actually has sexual relations with the female. The younger male doesn't. The question is, of course, why does the young male join him? And the biologists say he's an apprentice to learn how to sing, that's all. So that when he becomes an older male, he will also be able to attract females. It's just one example how in the natural world, often the older male will dominate and will not allow the younger male, as it were, to enjoy, the pleasures of sexual reproduction. So it happens across the board. Here, Darwin is suggesting that's the case in early human history. Of course, I want to emphasize all of this is speculation. There's no proof for any of this. There can't be. It's in the past. So you cannot prove anything about evolution, strictly speaking. The most that you can do is gather evidence and try to piece together a theory that makes sense of the evidence. But it's not like there's no laboratory where you can check what happened in the past, obviously. So it's all going to be speculative. Okay, then Freud says, he says we can shed light on this Darwinian theory, and remember that he's trying to explain the question of how incest is connected to totemism and exogamy. These are the two phenomena that he's trying to connect. And he says that psychoanalysis, what we've learned from psychoanalysis, throws light on this. He says there was one case in particular, which actually became quite famous in psychoanalytic history. It's a case of Little Hans, it's called. The name is a pseudonym, but today we know who Little Hans was. He was the opera producer in Vienna. Now Freud writes here, if you're following me, at page 128 at the bottom, he says, I published a study of this case. He says the boy had a phobia of horses, and as a result he refused to go out in the street. He expressed a fear that the horse would come into the room and bite him, and it turned out that this must be the punishment for a wish that the horse might fall down, in other words, die. He wished that the horse would die. After the boy's fear of his father had been removed by assurances, it became evident that he was struggling against wishes which had as their subject the idea of his father being absent, going away on a long journey or dying. He regarded his father as a competitor for the favors of his mother, towards whom obscure foreshadowings of his budding sexual wishes were aimed. Thus, he was situated in the typical attitude of a male child toward his parents, to which we have given the name of the Oedipus complex, and which we regard in general as the nuclear complex of the neuroses. So he says through analysis of this little boy, he was able to figure out that his feelings towards horses were actually transferred from his feelings towards his father, and that really what was behind all of this was emotions to which Freud gave the name of Oedipus. Oedipus Rex was a play by Sophocles. The story, as you know, is about a king who had a child, and he heard a prophecy that this child was going to kill him and take over his position. So he sent his child to be killed, but he sent his child with a slave, whatever, up to the mountains with a servant, and to kill him on the mountain. And the servant, of course, didn't kill the child. The child survived and was adopted by a different king and was raised in a different country. And then eventually, by fate, when he grew up to be a man, he was traveling down the road one day, and he came across the man who happened to be his biological father, Laius, whom he didn't know was his father. And he killed him because he got into an argument on the way. And then he continued along the road, and there's a whole story with the Sphinx. He had to solve a riddle of the Sphinx. And then the country where Laius was king made him king, and he married Jocasta, who was really his own mother. He didn't know that at the time. And then, of course, the story, that's all the background of the story. The story really begins when the prophet Tiresias reveals that the plague, the city is overtaken by a plague, everyone's dying, and the prophet Tiresias reveals it's because Oedipus, the king, is really the son of Jocasta, who's his wife and his mother, and he's the brother of his own children, right? He has children with his mother. So, of course, in the story, he doesn't know that it's his mother. But even when you read the story, if you have a chance to read Sophocles, there are indications, even in Sophocles, that on some subconscious level, somehow Oedipus was subconsciously vaguely aware that he was related to this woman, and that she was somehow his mother. And in any case, even when he finds out from the prophet Tiresias that she is his mother, he's in denial. He doesn't want, because he wants to say he loves her, he wants to stay married, and he doesn't care that it's his mother. So Freud takes this story as the basis of what he sees as the most fundamental psychological complex of human beings. It is, of course, a male complex. It's not a female complex. That there was an attempt, I believe it was Jung, Carl Jung, who advocated a complementary complex for women, which he called the Electra complex. It was named Electra after the story of. The story is not called Electra. It's also a trilogy. You know, ancient Greek tragedy was written in trilogies. In other words, it was 3 plays. Oedipus Rex is the first play, and then there's Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. So there's a play written by the Greek playwright before Sophocles named Aeschylus. And so Aeschylus wrote a trilogy which is known as the Oresteia trilogy. And in that story, there is the opposite story, is that a son kills not his father, but his mother, because of love for his father, and his sister, whose name is Electra, is with Orestes. He's the son, and Orestes and Electra, brother and sister, conspire to kill their own mother. And so, based on that play, Carl Jung said there's also an Electra complex, where a girl has emotional, erotic feelings towards her father as a little girl, and has to come to terms with that. Now, Freud and Jung had a bit of an argument over this. Freud felt that the Electra complex was not as fundamental to the human condition as the Oedipus complex. He didn't deny that little girls have this type of emotional attachment to their fathers, but he said it's not as fundamental. It's not as fundamental in explaining the basic problem with the human condition, which, if you think about it, is a great compliment, I would say, to women. It's not, at first it sounds like it's an insult. It sounds like it's a sexist. It's a sexism on Freud's part to say that, oh no, the Oedipus complex is more important. It's because we're saying the male story is more important. But in effect, I think it's actually the opposite. Freud is saying that the Electra complex is there, but it's not as problematic. It doesn't create so many issues for the human condition as the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is ultimately the source for Freud of human violence, whereas the Electra complex is not. Freud doesn't think that we can explain wars and murders and things like that because women are in love with their father and want to kill their mother. He doesn't think that that's true. But he thinks it is true that men want to kill men, want to kill their father and want to have sleep with their mothers, right? And that's the basic problem. So Freud used what he found in analysis as a theoretical basis to understand what must have happened in the original human condition. He says, any questions on that, by the way? No? Okay. Now, he says, we have to be a little bit subtle here. He says it's true, first of all, that these young men, these young sons of the primal father, are frustrated and they kill him. But we shouldn't think that they do it with a clean conscience. It's more complicated than that. So he says, to continue here, this on page 129, he says, analysis is able to trace the associative paths along which displacement passes. He's talking here about the displacement of the feelings towards the father onto an animal, for example, which, by the way, for him means it explains totemism. What is it? Remember, totemism is treating a certain animal as one's ancestor. So Freud found in the example of Hans, little Hans, and other psychoanalytic cases, this transference of the father image to some type of animal. So he says, given that, the analysis also enables us to discover the motives for the displacement. Why does a little boy transfer the feelings that he has towards his father, negative feelings? He's angry at his father. Why does he not tell his father, I hate you? Why does he say, I hate horses? I'm afraid of horses. He says the hatred of his father that arises in a boy from rivalry for his mother is not able to achieve uninhibited sway over his mind. It has to contend against his old established affection and admiration for the very same person. The child finds relief from the conflict arising out of this double-sided, this ambivalent emotional attitude towards his father by displacing his hostile and fearful feelings to a substitute for his father. Now this word now is key. Ambivalence. It's the same word in German. Ambivalenz. The etymology of ambivalence, valence, by itself means wave. Gal. So ambivalent means two waves. That's the etymology of it in any case. What does ambivalence mean? It means I feel contradictory emotions. The boy doesn't only hate his father, he also loves his father. He's aware that this man takes care of him. This man raised him, this man spends time with him, he teaches him. So he can't just hate his father. He hates his father because he loves his mother and feels himself in competition for the attentions of his mother. But on the other hand, apart from his mother, he also has a direct relationship with his father. So he has this, that's why it's called, maybe, I'm not sure about this actually, but I assume it's one reason it's called a complex, the Oedipus complex, because it's complicated. It's not one single emotion. It's at least two emotions in conflict with each other. So this is one reason, Freud says, why the boy transfers the feelings of hatred that he has towards his father onto something else, onto a horse, onto a dog. He gives another case of a child who's afraid of dogs and has for the same reason. He says he doesn't want to say, I hate my father. So he says, no, I'm afraid of dogs, I hate dogs. And he thinks of the emotions that he feels towards his father are somehow displaced onto something else. That's what he mentions. He says even in the case of little Hans, who was afraid of horses, he says little Hans was not only frightened of horses, he also approached them with admiration and interest. He was fascinated by horses. Like so, little kids often are. They're attracted to something that scares them. They want to see it, but they run away. They don't know how they're feeling. They have both emotions. And he says, in this is how Freud wants to explain the relationship that primitive human beings have towards the totem. The totem, on the one hand, which is an animal that they're afraid of, and they respect, and they worship, and a type of fear, and at the same time it's an animal they love, and they worship. Worship itself is a complicated feeling, because worship, like we say in English, as a translation of the Hebrew, ira, in Hebrew, when we talk about the feelings of fear that a pious person has towards God, we don't use the word pachad. Pachad is simple fear, I'm afraid. But ira is a feeling which in English we translate as awe, A-W-E. Awe means, in English like in Hebrew, means awe, even if the word tells you what it means. It's awe. I might open my mouth, right? It means I'm afraid, but I'm also amazed. I'm amazed. So even my fear, whereas for example in pachad, in pure fear, you just run away. I'm scared, right? I'm run away. But in awe, you don't run away. You're kind of frozen on the spot because you're amazed by something.
Awful is the same.
Awful is exactly from awe. Exactly. Yes.
It's funny that awesome
Yes,
has
awesome.
positive connotation.
Yes.
Just like terrific from terror. Terrific.
Yes.
Awesome.
Exactly.
In American English at least.
Yes. You should know, by the way, that in today's English, awful is purely negative. Awesome is positive, right? Awful is negative. However, if you go back 100 years, even and certainly more, like you read in Shakespeare, awful is positive. You would say in an old translation, for example, in the King James translation of the Torah, you would say the awful God. Today, awful God sounds negative, but in Old English, awful means awful is also positive. Yeah, Hagadol Gibor Vanora. Right? Yeah, exactly. Or in Hebrew we speak about Irat Shamayim. Right? Ira is the awe of heaven. Exactly, right. It's which they translate sometimes fear, but fear is not the best translation. So awe is ira is ambivalent. The emotion itself is inherently ambivalent, and that is a basic emotion of all religion. You mentioned terror. There was a great, very important book written by a German theologian in the early 20th century named Rudolf Otto, a book called Das Heilige, the Holy, and there he used the expression in Latin, mysterium tremendum, a tremendous mystery. So tremendum is the same thing. It's like terror, but it's a positive terror. It's tremendous. It's terrifying, but it's also amazing. It's in a positive sense, and that's the basic religious feeling. Is this feeling of the tremendous, which Freud again says that the source of this feeling is the emotion that a boy has towards his father, not towards his mother. Towards his mother is a much more purely positive feeling.
No, I'm thinking what happened now that when you have two fathers.
Yeah.
So many of them are two mothers. Who are going to bed?
Yeah. It is interesting. It's a complicated question, obviously. I can tell you my opinion on it, but I'm not a psychologist, or I've seen now and then, gay parents working with their children, And from what I've seen, first of all, chas v'chalila, whatever I say should not be taken as a legal statement. In other words, legally, obviously, I'm a very open-minded person. So even though halakha says it's asur, obviously that's halakha. The Torah says it's wrong, obviously. But as a Western democratic cosmopolitan human being, obviously I think people should have the right to marry whomever they want. In fact, I think I'm more open-minded than most people.
From the eye of the child.
Yeah, from the eye of the child. Yeah. So from what I've seen, it's usually what you're pointing out is a real problem. I've seen two fathers and I've seen two mothers, and to my eyes, it's wrong because the child is confused because it's too much of a single energy. There's one energy, either too much fatherhood, too much motherhood, and there's no balance. There's a certain lack of balance in the child. From what I've seen, it's worse than having a single parent because you have double of the same energy. You have too much father in your life. You have too much mother in your life, right? But that's my impression. That's a clinical, personal impression.
Yeah. I think one of them is always more feminine.
More
feminine in a couple.
Yes, usually that's also true in a gay couple. Yeah.
It has the energy of the mother more.
The truth is, it's much more complicated than that because gay, just speaking from my personal experiences, gay people don't fit into the typical male-female emotional constitution. So a gay woman is not feminine, typically speaking, in the way that a heterosexual woman is feminine, and a gay man is not masculine in the typical way that a heterosexual man is masculine. So in a way, it's not quite true to say that they have too much father, because it's also in a way they don't have enough father, because it's not a typical masculine father. Neither one of them is. So it gets complicated, right? So we're talking here about a version of father and motherhood which is old-fashioned traditional. Freud is not a Torah observant Jew, but his concept of fatherhood and motherhood is very traditional. And the question is quite complicated. I mean, if you know anything about gender theory today, there's a great theoretician, she's actually Jewish, named Judith Butler. She was one of the great theoreticians on the question of gender. She herself is a lesbian Jew who wrote a very important book in gender theory called Gender Trouble, where she says, for example, when I read that, I found it very enlightening. She says feminism is sexism because feminists are still working with a theory that is old-fashioned, that old-fashioned father, old-fashioned mother, old-fashioned male, old-fashioned female. So the whole, in our times, the concept of gender has become so plastic, so stretchable, that we have to have new ways of thinking. And when we talk about, and when we put forward a Torah concept, in a way, it's actually I find the situation very beautiful because you cannot, when we discuss a Torah concept of male and female, father and mother, you cannot take it for granted. You have to explain and you have to argue why an old-fashioned father is a good thing, why an old-fashioned mother is a good thing. You can't take it for granted. I think it's a great challenge. And I think it's a healthy challenge. I think it's good. I think we need to argue and to explain why old-fashioned motherhood is a good thing. And by the way, I mentioned yesterday in our lecture, there have been periods in history, for example, the time of Noah, where they also had gender trouble. It was not clear what is really a father or mother, what really is a man or a woman. And then you had to have individuals like Avram Avinu, like Sarai Imenu, who stood up and said, this is a father, I am a father, this is how you do it. I have to show you an example. This is the best way to do it. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but there is a certain dogmatism. Avraham Avinu is a father, he's Avinu, because the concept of father was not clear. He had to show, this is fatherhood. Do you agree or not? It's up to you. Avraham Avinu didn't go around, it was no jihad. He didn't go around killing everybody who disagreed with him. If you don't want to raise children this way, fine, what can I do? All I can do is teach you my version of fatherhood, that's all. It's not enough to look at the Torah as a bunch of examples of paradigms of what we have to be. We have to see the paradigms as being built by human beings under the eyes of God. And only when we see them that way are we able to discuss it with other examples, which of course the Torah also gives. Or the Torah tells us that other peoples also had their own versions of what it means to be a father and a mother and a brother and a sister. It's interesting because you see, here we see Freud struggling with this very same issue. He's saying, Freud is asking, what exactly is fatherhood? What is motherhood? What is a son? What is a daughter? When we look at, he's saying, he's giving us a theory of history, but which is questionable. You can say, well, Freud, you're building up a whole theory. How do we know any of it is true? It's poetry. It's a myth. It's a mythology. And at the end of the day, Freud would have to say, you're right. It's a myth. What can I tell you? It's a theory. It's not more than a theory. But something that is not so mythological is his work as a psychoanalyst. And he's saying, look, I deal with patients who are fathers and mothers and sons and daughters. And I'm trying to understand what it means from these patients to be a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. And people have issues. People don't know how to be fathers and mothers and sons and daughters. People have a hard time doing it. You would think it's such an obvious thing. What's easier to be? The easiest thing in the world is to be a father. Not really. Or a mother. Not at all. Because as soon as you're a father, you have fundamental challenges. If you have a son, you have a fundamental challenge now, because the son is biologically wired to be attracted to the warmth and the affection, the softness, the love of his mother. And he's not wired to feel that towards his father. His father is on the one hand, he knows he's like his father. On the other hand, that's the problem. His father is tough. And he doesn't like it. He feels uncomfortable with his father's presence. And so he's attracted to the one parent more than the other. And this becomes, and also in Judaism, this is a huge, huge issue, because what is the first job of a Jewish father? It plays right into this. It's terrifying. It's terrifying from a Freudian standpoint, right? The son is born, he comes out of his mother's, first of all, the son is inside of a womb, inside of a rechem, and it's not an accident. In Hebrew, as you probably know, there's a beautiful etymological link between the word rachamim, which means mercy and compassion, and the etymology of the word rachamim is uterus, rechem, with a womb where we spend 9 months in a very warm, quiet, comfortable place. The little boy comes out and he's a little bit scared, and the mother takes him back on her body, and he's on her breast, and she's back in the warmth of his mother. And then, after a week is finished, the father takes this innocent little boy who knows only happiness with his mother, and he cuts him. He cuts him, and not only does he cut him, and he introduces the most violent thing the boy has experienced. Not only does he cut him, he cuts him in the spot where that boy is going to, in the subconscious of the boy, he's always going to associate it with sexuality, which is his connection, according to Freud, to the mother. Right? The boy will have, Freud tells us, has a sexual, erotic connection to the mother. And the father tells him, that connection, I'm going to cause you pain in that connection. And according to Judaism, that is the secret of being a Jewish gever, being a Jewish man, is to know that that's the most problematic spot in your whole body. That spot in your body is going to create all the biggest problems in your life. And you should know, you should be traumatized in that spot, according to Judaism, right? Now, that's positive and negative. From a humanist, secular, feminist standpoint, you would say that's the worst trauma, the most violent thing you could do to a human being. You've just destroyed a man. Any chance of that boy being a healthy man has been destroyed, right? From a Jewish standpoint, it's the very opposite. We say, no, adarabah. We say, on the contrary, that by problematizing that, we now have a chance to make this boy, eventually, not now, it's true he's going to suffer maybe even more from an Oedipal complex. Now he's really going to want his mommy, because he knows now his father is a very violent parent. And so he's going to be even more of a mama's boy, more attached to his mother. So now the challenge of a father, of a Jewish father, is how to bring the boy close with violence, with the violence that he causes his son. He has to now work extra hard to bring his son close to him. And a Jewish father, of course, to be a Jewish father is to have the challenge. For a Jewish father, it's all about the challenge of how do I now make this boy love me, given that he knows that I'm the violent one. Right? It's a tremendous challenge. But that's the whole challenge of Jewish fatherhood. In one word, there is one word to explain what that challenge is, and that word is Torah. Torah, in a single word, tells us what the father's job is, which will bring this boy now close to him. And the closeness that he will achieve with his son will never be the closeness that the son has with a mother. It can't be. Because it's always predicated, the premise is always violence. It's always a subtext of, I'm the guy who hurt you. You are alone. Right? But that's what, and that is a Jewish man always has to feel. I'm getting ahead of myself here, right? I'm already giving an answer to Freud, but a Jewish man always has to feel a certain distance that makes him uncomfortable in the world vis-a-vis his mother. Right? He will never be connected to his mother the way he would like to be. The way really, this becomes a very, very complex thing, in other forms of psychology which emphasize the boy's connection to his mother. And as you probably know, there are very important early religions which are matriarchal rather than patriarchal, where the god is not a father god but a mother god, the great mother goddess. And even in Jewish history, in the Tanakh, there are moments where the Jews are tempted to abandon God the Father in preference for God the Mother, with Ashteret and so on. And Yirmiyahu talks about a period where the Jews were much more inclined towards a maternal image of God. It becomes very complicated because in the Tanakh God wants to maintain a male image. It's God the Father. It's Avinu Malkeinu. It's Avinu. It's not Imenu. On the other hand, it becomes even more complicated because of the presence of God in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Mishkan, is something that we call the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah is a feminine presence. So there is a kind of refactoring of a female divine presence, but always with the subtext of a male divine presence. Okay, again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. And of course, all of this everything that I'm saying is all from the perspective of the man, of the male. Because the whole time you have the question, okay, well that's very nice for a Jewish man, what about a Jewish woman? If Jewish men are supposed to feel this way, how are Jewish women supposed to feel? Are they supposed to feel traumatized? Jewish women don't have brit mila. They don't suffer as women. They don't suffer from an Oedipal complex. So what is their role in the Oedipal relationship?
That's my fundamental issue with everything. Just so you can give one prepared
complex, the seducer is the mother. So
The what? Sorry, what's the
the
mother?
seducer, actually.
Oh, okay, it's seducer. Okay, yeah.
There. So basically, once again, it's women who take the blame.
I never understood Freud to suggest that the mother is to blame in the scenario. He's saying that the whole Oedipus complex is told from the standpoint of the son. So it's not now. It's also true that Jewish mothers, but this is also true, I think, in both cases, that it's a very, very common phenomenon I've seen in my life, even in my own personal life, that mothers, women, who are in a less than satisfying marriage, whose husbands are not adequately attentive. And unfortunately, in human history, husbands are not very attentive, not adequately attentive to their wives. So it does happen quite often that when a woman especially has a son, that she will project whatever she's missing from her husband onto her son.
Absolutely.
And her son will become a substitute husband in many, obviously, we're not talking about sex, we're not talking about perversion, we're talking about emotions. Right. That emotionally, the son will become the little husband. There's no question, right? However, aside from that is an important dynamic that generally does happen. But the Oedipus complex is not talking about it, I don't think. The Oedipus complex is not even talking about that. The Oedipus complex is saying that from the standpoint of the son, not of the mother, that only from the standpoint of the son, when a child, a little boy, feels two types of energies coming from his parents. One of them is very protective. It's the source where he came out of the body of that one, and the other one is, by comparison, less protective, colder, and more aggressive. And the son, as he grows up, he sees that not only does the source of his protection and his love, not only is there one source of protection towards him, but that very same source is giving also comfort and protection to the other source, which is giving him violence. So the triangle in the child's mind is an off-balanced triangle. And Freud is simply saying that fundamental setup of the human condition caused that fundamental imbalance is an issue. And he is saying, and I tend to agree with him on this point, even though, again, I have daughters, I'm aware, even as a father towards daughters, of the Electra dynamic. I think there is an Electra dynamic. Because why? Because all children will naturally have emotions towards the parent of the opposite sex, the parent who is not like them. So there's no question in my mind that daughters have a dynamic with their father in a good relationship that they can't have towards their mother. However, I do think that that it's not a mirror complex. I don't think the Electra complex is as complicated as the Oedipal complex. And I think that a simple proof is human history. Human history shows that men are more problematic, if I can use that word, than women. In the sense, not more sophisticated. If anything, less sophisticated. Men are less sophisticated than women and more problematic. In other words, because men universally, in every culture that there is, are more violent. Why? The only time that women are more violent is in mythology, when we talk about Amazons and things like that. But that's unheard of. What culture in the world exists in which women, there were matriarchies, there definitely were matriarchal cultures, but I've never heard of a culture where the women go around raping and abusing and starting wars and have all kinds of ambitious claims upon other cultures and so on. I've never heard of that. So it suggests that fact, that's a very big fact. That fact alone suggests that Freud might be onto something. That's all. And I don't think by the way, I don't think it's an insult to women. I think on the contrary, it suggests that it's an insult to men, if anything. It suggests, like the Torah we often say this Jews say this from the standpoint of the Torah, that men are inferior to women spiritually. That in a way, I think this is what the Torah would agree with Freud. What does it mean that men are inferior spiritually to women? Why is it that the XY chromosome combination is inferior to XX? It seems to be that the XY chromosome combination is more complicated. It creates a dissonance, an ambivalence in men's brains that women don't have. On some deep, deep level. Again, this is very, very general. It's not taking into account the complexities of being a woman, chas v'shalom. And it's not, and it's for sure not to suggest that there's any type of value to one sex over the other. That would be completely ridiculous. I'm not suggesting that at all, obviously. It's simply to point out that there are different issues in the traditional male psyche versus the traditional female psyche. That's all.